So this video is all about the Dutch and their emergence as kind of like almost a counter on all the absolutism going around in Europe right now. So their political system is very, very different. And they have a completely different way of doing things. And it's almost like an alternative or a counter to all the absolutism and centralization in Europe right now. The Dutch are more decentralized, and it's sometimes called constitutionalism. They don't actually have a monarch, or at least not an all-powerful monarch like France and stuff. So they have, much like England is a constitutional monarchy during this period. They will have a constitution that limits the power of a monarch and limits the power of a ruler and stuff like that. It's technically not a monarch, but we'll get into that in a second here. So the Netherlands, I think, are one of the more interesting countries to talk about in AP Euro. And before we can get into like their main achievements and stuff like that during the age of absolutism, we need to back up a little bit and talk about them during the 1600s. So it was going to be, just with all of these things, it's a golden age during the age of absolutism. The Dutch are at kind of the peak of their power. So we've sort of touched on them here and there, but today and tomorrow is going to be all about the Dutch and their kind of role in European history. So kind of like how we've had cameos from like Sweden and stuff like that. This is the Netherlands cameo in the story of AP Euro. So the Netherlands is set up as a republic mostly, sort of. We'll get into the details of it, but the closest thing it is a republic. It's a Calvinist sanctuary, and they have religious tolerance. So a lot of Calvinists moved there, and it's very religiously tolerant, at least relative to other places in Europe at the time. They have a stable, thriving economy because of their it's called carry trade, which we'll get into. So they have this world empire of trade networks. And they thrive because they do things a little differently than everybody else. And so all this economic prosperity creates a golden age of artists and thinkers in the Netherlands. Okay, so the Dutch revolt way back in the 1500s, we sort of talked about this. The Netherlands, which you can see on the map up here, just across, this is England here and France here, they were subject and under the rule of the Spanish. Okay, and King Philip II, which, if you remember, he's the one who tried to invade England and things like that. This is even before that. He sends the Duke of Alba, okay, military commander, that's all you really need to know about him, to quote unquote restore order in the Netherlands. Now, the reason why I needed to restore order is that the Dutch wanted to be their own. They wanted to be their own thing. They wanted to have like religious freedom. They wanted toleration for Protestants and stuff like that. Philip II said no. He thought that the Netherlands was going to be this kind of hellscape, and it would like cause all this like evil and stuff like that in Europe. It was allowed to be Protestant. Okay, he originally at first says yes, but then changes his mind when he starts to think that this could have severe problems. Like I said, it would become like a hell on earth for Europe. Okay, and so he sends in the Duke of Alba to quote unquote restore order and put down this religious motivated uprising there. Okay, so in the southern Netherlands, which is now Belgium today, the Duke of Alba shows up and creates a council to restore order. This council formally is known as the Council of Troubles because they're trying to manage all the trouble in the Netherlands. But it gets the nickname the Council of Blood because what it ultimately ends up doing is they kill Calvinist nobles, they have heavy taxes, and it causes lots of suffering in the Netherlands. And eventually this will lead to a full-scale revolt. So the Duke of Alba puts on cracks down the Netherlands on the Dutch so much that sparks an even larger rebellion. And whereas before it was just more like a political resistance, now it's like full-scale bloodshed and war. Okay, so the Catholic nobles in the south, which, like I said, eventually will be Belgium, decide that they don't want to continue this fight after a while, and they decide to just side with the Spanish, and they become what will be known for a while as the Spanish Netherlands. So they break away and agree to remain part of Spain. They're Catholic, whatever. The Union of Utrecht, which is going to be Protestant, basically forms the modern Netherlands, which is up here in like this yellowish color. So these countries in purple break away once it's clear that in the middle of this revolt, this is kind of like the peace agreement. And what happens is the Union of Utrecht will form what will be the modern Netherlands in the north, and then the south, Belgium, which will be under Spanish rule for a while, but will eventually um, become its own country in Belgium. Okay, so you had a larger country. It's broken in half during the middle of this revolt. That's still under Spanish control in the south. And so the Netherlands in the 1600s, okay, it looks like this. So the United Provinces, which is united by the Union of Utrecht, is up here. You'll notice that it's kind of like broken. You can kind of see it's very like the ocean and it's I guess, coastline is very unique. And the ocean plays a significant role in Dutch history. And the Dutch are kind of, some people say, like they're constantly battling with the ocean. The Netherlands is a very flat country. The entire country, the land is almost entirely at sea level. And so they're constantly battling with the ocean and the tides to kind of basically exist. We'll talk a little bit about that too, because it's one of the reasons why they're a very prosperous country. Okay. So this war, after like that brief interlude where everyone breaks up, it drags on and on and on. It's called the 80 Years' War in Dutch history. Eventually, the Spanish spend so much money um, with this. The Dutch were getting aid from the English, which is why Philip II eventually invades England. So they the Spanish are having to keep a standing army in the Netherlands to fight them, and they're trying to fight the English at the same time because the English were helping the Netherlands. It's just too much. On top of that, the price revolution is happening, and inflation is just catching up to them, and they can't pay their bills. Okay, they just don't have enough money to pay their bills with the prices rising. Okay, so King Philip IV takes the throne in 1621, and he's pretty stubborn and refuses to let the Netherlands go, even though economically and politically, with like the reasons I brought up here, it just doesn't make sense anymore. The Dutch revolt actually gets folded into the 30 Years' War, okay, and they become allies with France. So again, just to reiterate, 30 Years' War, it becomes a political conflict because you have a Calvinist country, the Netherlands, allying with a Catholic country, the French, because it benefits both of them to have a weak Spain. Okay. And so in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia acknowledges Dutch independence and they become their own thing. So some of the Huguenots from France, other religious minorities, Jews, and stuff like that, they leave their countries and come to the Netherlands because it's a relatively religiously tolerant place. And this is going to bring a lot of wealth and expertise into the Netherlands, which is going to give them a tremendous advantage. Okay. So in 1648, the country is reformatted to be a constitutionalist state, meaning they have, you know, a sort of constitutional monarch around this House of Orange. We'll talk about them in just a second here. But then each individual province is its own thing and has a lot of kind of like local democracy at like a little smaller local levels. Okay, so the nobles have some power, but they're weak, and so these provinces, how it works is at the local level, they have like their local assemblies, okay, and then they have a states general, which is when representatives from the local level come up and meet and discuss national issues. Above them and kind of next to them is the stadtholder, which is the person in charge of the army. Okay, so the Dutch do have a standing army, or at least one that's controlled by this group or this person. And the stadtholder typically was the House of Orange, okay, which is the royal family of the Netherlands. So that's what I mean. Like it's kind of a constitutional monarchy. You don't like the king doesn't have like legislative power at all. He only has like military power. So it's not quite the same as it is in England, but it's similar. Okay. The House of Orange will try and make themselves be more like England all the time to eventually where William of Orange will leave and go to England to be king. But that's a different story. So they want to centralize the government, but the Dutch people push back on it enough that it just never happens. Okay. So it's a constitution backed state with a system that is very democratic, at least relatively, in Europe at this time. So a lot of the people that have influence in the States General are these worthy merchants and bankers. They held most of the power and most of the seats in government, mainly because they could afford to not work sometimes and operate in government. But also they have an interest in shaping government policy because they have a lot of wealth and things like that. So like I said, the House of Orange is the stadtholders. And like I said, eventually they will leave and go try and become kings of England. The Dutch they make most of their money off of something called carrying trade. Okay. Basically, what they do is they ship things around the world. That's how they make their money. So they ship different items all around the world, which we'll talk about some of it, like diamonds, linens, pottery, things like that. They don't have a lot of inflation, unlike Spain. They're able to keep that under control. And then also, the Dutch are also undertaking something called the Land Reclamation Project, which I'll talk about in a different slide here in just a minute. But that will help them internally produce some goods for export as well. So one of the things that they produce is this kind of nasty thing called chevet oil. It's kind of like cologne, and it comes from the anal glands of this cat here, but it was a delicacy back then. That's one thing that they're selling to everybody. They would also sell coffee beans that have been digested by these Southeast Asian cats. Basically, they would eat them, poop the beans out, and then brew them in coffee. Again, delicacy. But one of the issues that the Netherlands was able to overcome that helps them produce things internally is, like I said, the land reclamation project. If you look on the map here, most of the land that's in dark blue here is below sea level. So you notice, like along the coast here, there's some areas that are above sea level, but then this is below. So in theory, over time, these areas should flood. What the Dutch did is they built up these large mounds to kind of take back land and essentially make the Netherlands bigger. They made their country bigger over time. It's very impressive. So what they were able to do is they took land from inside like the Netherlands that was above sea level, buried it up here to create like a canal or something that is create a dike to kind of block the water out. And then what would happen is then they would drain this using windmills and pumping the water out into the ocean. They build these large dikes, okay, build a windmill on top of it. The windmill would act as a pump and pump the water out. And so in 1300, this is what the Netherlands looked like. They had done this so much that they were able to actually pump out and add like a significant chunk of land right here, here, and also down in the south. And so they're able to gain more land, which are used to produce agricultural goods, and also like the famous Dutch tulips, which we'll talk about later, that they were able to sell all around Europe as well. Okay, so this makes them very successful as far as producing some goods internally. The Dutch primarily are still all about trade and that carrying of different goods, such as that chevet stuff. But also they also sold slaves and carried slaves and stuff too. But the Dutch are able to do what they do because of their financial innovations. So their business practice of moving goods from one place to another, that's not new. The way they pay for it and are able to expand, given how small they are, that's new. So they were one of the first countries to have a large, quote unquote, modern stock exchange. Okay, and this stock exchange was one of the largest and first of its kind. It helps with economic growth. And so if you don't know this, companies sell stock to raise money to undertake different projects. So different companies that would be traded on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, such as the Dutch East India Company, which this is their logo right here, they would sell stock and then use that money to fund more ventures around the world and exploration and bring goods back and things like that. So it would help create wealth, money, jobs through that. Okay, because as the Dutch VOC or East India Company does more exploration, it creates jobs and income for everybody. Okay, so the stock exchange helps with economic growth in that sense. It creates new ventures and creates more economic possibilities. Okay, the Dutch are also financial innovators. They create what looks today like modern insurance contracts. Basically, if you sail around the world on your ship and your ship gets destroyed, you could collect insurance if your ship gets destroyed. They also create options trading and futures. What those are is that futures contracts, like if you think the price of gas is going to go up in a couple months, you can buy a futures contract and lock in the price of gas right now and lock in this lower price. That's what a futures contract does. Okay. It also locks in the option to sell. There's buying and selling futures contracts. Basically, what I want you to take away from this is that they're financial innovators. They find new ways to pay for things through futures options and trading of commodities. So you could like buy and sell like gold or something on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Okay, so it's all new and it allows them to collect a lot of money. One of the things that also help with this economic expansion is the Bank of Amsterdam. They kind of like how the stock exchange lend, they sell a company sell stock to undertake projects. Sometimes companies also have to borrow money to undertake new projects and new economic ventures, and that's what the Bank of Amsterdam would do. It would lend out money to people to undertake new business ventures and new economic opportunities that could be taken advantage of. So it's initially just as with the Netherlands, like within like within the Netherlands, people are doing this to pay for like the land reclamation project, all the voyages of exploration and trade. But eventually, the Bank of Amsterdam is going to become the financial center of Europe. Okay, like Louis the 14th, the Russians, they will all borrow money from the Bank of Amsterdam. Okay. Now I mentioned tulips a second ago. Um, there's the Dutch financial innovations is a double-edged sword. Okay, it eventually causes a lot of economic growth and prosperity, but it also creates a recipe for financial destruction. So I'm going to post this video along with this one, and you can watch it. But it talks about something called that economists have looked at called tulip mania, where basically like the Dutch were able to grow these super beautiful tulips, which I have a picture of here. Okay, so look at how deep and rich the colors are. There's a scene where they're in the Netherlands in Spider-Man 3, and like Spider-Man gets picked up in a tulip field. But eventually it got to the point where people around Europe valued these bulbs of tulips so much that one bulb equaled 3 years' wages of a master Dutch artisan. So they were very, very expensive. Okay. Because they were so pretty and no one had ever been able to grow things like this. A lot of people think that the reason why the Dutch are able to grow flowers like this is because of the land reclamation project and the unique nutrients in the soil from the ocean floor. That's just one theory. But what happens is the price of tulips gets bid up to the point where they start selling futures contracts on the price of tulips, which you can see here in the graph. So they think that the price of tulips is going to keep going up and up and up. But eventually, everyone realizes that these are just flowers. And while they're pretty, they're not worth 3 years' wages for somebody. And so the market crashes, which you can see in the graph there. And so, like, this kind of sets up the boom bust cycle of our modern economy, or at least foreshadows it, because we're based on these financial innovations from the Dutch back then. Another major component of the Dutch, which I've talked about already, and there's a separate video on it that you're going to watch, is the Dutch East India Company. Okay. The Dutch exploration stuff is all about making money. They don't care about religious conversion. They don't care about any of the political stuff. It's all about making money. And so it makes them successful because they're not worried about those other concerns and they're actually more cooperative with native people. So they specialize in carrying goods all over. You can see the trade routes here. They eventually take the routes that the Portuguese had into Asia, and they become the ones carrying spices from Asia back to Europe, which is what the other video is all about. They also carry slaves and things like that from Africa to South America and North America too. And so they make lots of money and things based off of that as well. What you're going to do is you're going to watch this video, which I'll post another time, about the Dutch VOC, the East India Company, and its business practices. All of this economic influx leads to a golden age of Dutch art, which we have looked at a little bit already. But Dutch art looks highly realistic. Okay. And so with this increased money coming in from all this trade and exploration, the Dutch were able to finance these art projects, very similar to like the Renaissance, which is why it's called the Dutch Golden Age. Okay. Eventually, though, the Dutch are, with all the financial innovation, that you have, that allows them to punch above their weight economically and politically. Eventually, though, mercantilism is a zero-sum game. So they're ultimately competing with countries that have more manpower than they do, and they just cannot compete with it. And so France is going to challenge them in East Asia and England in the Americas. And literally, England is going to copy the Dutch economic model with like the stock exchanges and the futures contracts and the Bank of Amsterdam and all stuff like that, which eventually will be the Bank of London. But they basically lift the Dutch practices and apply them to England. So the Dutch were able to compete with England and France because of those innovations. Now the people they're competing with embrace those innovations. The gap grows, and the Dutch just can't keep up. So the French and the English bully the Dutch out of their trade routes and stuff like that in East Asia, like in Sri Lanka and stuff like that. And eventually, William of Orange is going to become king of England and import a lot of the Dutch methods to England, and that's ultimately what's going to lead to English supremacy. So some economic historians have called this a economic merger, because what happens is the royal family from the Netherlands comes to England and then takes all of the Dutch business practices to England, which allows England to emerge as a world superpower economically and politically. So the significance of the Dutch is that their model shows that there's an alternative to absolutism out there. Constitutionalism can work, and also their economic prowess leads to some of the financial institutions that we have today. And that's ultimately why they're significant in both European and world history.